All right, welcome back to the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta. Glad you're here. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the anniversary of Desert Storm and the price of excellence, which we've kind of hinted at a little bit, but we'll be diving in. As always, you can follow me on Instagram and YouTube. Hit like, hit follow, share with your friends, share the podcast with your friends wherever you get your podcast. Let them know so they can like and follow. We'll jump right in. Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta. And in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. So this year I've been doing some anniversaries, and in January is the anniversary of Operation Desert Storm, the U.S. led coalition invasion of Iraq. So a little background, as we are wont to do around here, a little history background. In August of 1990, Saddam Hussein's forces, Iraqi forces, invaded Kuwait. And this was over several things, a border dispute, but primarily it was around the idea that the Iraqis owed the Kuwaitis some money, mostly from the Iran-Iraq war, which the Iraqis had borrowed money from the Kuwaitis to fight against Iran. And so as a result, they were indebted, and Saddam did not want to pay that back. And there's other things involving lateral drilling of Kuwaiti oil companies into Iraqi territory, allegedly, and so forth. So, in any case, in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq. And this is an interesting time. Of course, it's nearing the end of the Cold War, as we've discussed, or the collapse of the Soviet Union and other things. And so there's just a lot of things happening in history. And but what essentially happens is President George Bush, the first one, gives Saddam a mandate, pull out or expect retaliation, and the U.S. puts together a fairly large coalition of forces. It takes about 6 months to build up the forces, and in January of 1991, Operation Desert Storm begins. As you are probably aware, if you are a follower of these kind of things, Operation Desert Storm is a huge lopsided victory, and that the victory really showcases U.S. forces, U.S. military power in a way that the world had not experienced up to that point. Frankly, in the aftermath of Vietnam, the U.S. was not perceived to be as strong potentially as it is, and in the wake of Vietnam in the 1980s, the U.S. developed several new technologies that were largely untested, things like the Black Hawk helicopter, the Apache helicopter, and other aircraft like the F-117 stealth and laser-guided munitions, GPS guidance systems, etc., etc., etc. There's a whole laundry list of technologies that the U.S. developed in the late 1970s and 1980s in the lead-up that contribute to the U.S. victory. The problem was, of course, in 1991, nobody really knew what this was going to be like. And so in hindsight, it's pretty easy to look back and go, hey, this was a guaranteed win for the United States. But the reality was a little bit different. Frankly, just from a development perspective, the U.S. forces and the Iraqi forces were relatively on par as far as like what year or the vintage, if you will, of most of our military equipment. So Iraq had similar vintage Soviet-made tanks to the U.S. M1 tanks. Most of the Iraqi Air Force was in similar age. They had MiG-29s and MiG-23s and MiG-25s that were all Soviet-made, of about the same vintage of US F-15s, US F-111s, etc. And then from a force size perspective, the Iraqi army was the third largest army in the world at the time. And in Kuwait alone, there were more Iraqi forces than there were U.S. forces in the entire Middle Eastern theater when the operation kicked off. And then from an air power perspective, the U.S. Air Force and Navy and Marine Corps air arms were about equivalent in size, although slightly smaller than the Iraqi Air Force. So, what does that say? Well, on paper at least, the U.S. military and the Iraqi military squared off across the lines in the sand, as it were pretty evenly matched as far as age and numbers of fighting forces. Obviously, that did not turn out. It did not turn out as everybody expected. It was a very lopsided victory, and the sort of the way the campaign unfolded had a lot to do with that. It was about a 3-week initial air campaign, and then a 100-hour ground campaign that secured the victory. And the ground campaign never actually pushes very far into Iraq before the Iraqis agree to the surrender terms. And the surrender terms, I think, are really the key to why the victory comes so quickly and why it is so lopsided, right? And the surrender terms are pretty simple. George Bush lays out that the main objective of this campaign is to status quo ante. In other words, turn back the clock to what happened before the Iraq invasion of Kuwait. So we're going to push all Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. We're going to reestablish the borders of Kuwait and, the sovereignty of the Kuwaiti government. That's pretty straightforward stuff. Right? It's not a total surrender. It's not an overthrow of the Saddam Hussein's government. So I think once the Iraqi forces were driven out of Kuwait, it was a pretty straightforward thing for them to surrender before it got more out of hand. And I think had the Iraqis not surrendered when they did, it could have turned into a much more drawn out fight. The interesting thing, I think, though, is from a historical perspective, or sort of a pop culture historical perspective, we tend to look back, in my opinion, on Desert Storm as this sort of pinnacle American hegemonic moment and that there is some truth in that, is that this is really like the U.S.'s the full might of the U.S.'s capabilities on display, and this is what how U.S. power is going to be used in this post-Cold War world, is we're going to use it to sort of upset the balance of power in the world. We're going to make sure that there's no rogue dictators out there that are doing rogue dictator kind of things, and we're going to secure the peace even further than the end of the Cold War by using our power to do that. The interesting thing, of course, is that in the aftermath of the Cold War, and frankly even in the aftermath of the Desert Storm victory, the U.S. elects to massively draw down its military. So there's massive cuts to the military that lead to a pretty steep decline in the numbers and frankly, capabilities of some of the U.S. military. And so from that perspective, right, this one moment of Desert Storm serves as a sort of like, oh, this is what the U.S. can do, but it's really more like this is what the U.S. could do at this one moment in time when the Soviet Union was no longer a threat, when there was this large, massively built up, technologically advanced military that was really nobody had on par with them. And, oh, by the way, the U.S. military forces also had very extensive and deep training to do all of the things that they did, in addition to the large numbers. And then the aftermath of that, of course, is that the U.S. military draws down, and it's much less capable of doing that thing that it was in that one moment of time. So I think the comparisons of like what a modern day conflict might look like, in the sort of hand-wringing that we see a lot of times in U.S. defense wonk circles, as it is, right, about the threat of Russian or Chinese developments. I think those are very real things to consider, and looking at this one moment, and hoping that we can return to that moment of of pinnacle American superiority, I think it is very challenging at this point in our history. So we can use Desert Storm as an example. We can use it as a warning. There's various ways to look at it, but I think in the end, it is actually unique in that it is a very singular moment in U.S. history of like just how powerful and capable the U.S. is in this moment in time when there are no other major hegemonic threats in the globe, which is no longer the case. So there you go. Now you know a little more about Desert Storm and my opinions about it. All right. As always, hit like and follow and share with your friends. So we've talked about this a little bit in maybe oblique terms, but I want to dive in a little deeper today on the idea of like the price of excellence, right? I've seen and heard things about like people say things like, winning doesn't care, and that's true, right? And the price, and I've even talked about it, like the price you have to pay and the grind and all these things for being excellent. And I think everybody wants to be excellent. I don't think that's a hard stretch to say, right? Like everybody wants to be excellent, sure. Not everybody's willing to do the thing that it requires to be excellent. And I think also most people don't realize how demanding like being the pinnacle, the best is. In the last episode, we talked about how like everybody in the comparison trap of like everybody always sees other people's success, but they don't see like the work that goes into it. And I think that, right, is really encapsulative of what I'm talking about, is like there is a ton of work, like a ton of work that goes into being excellent. You got to wake up every morning and put your mind to like, this is what I'm doing today, no matter what. And it's just not something that you can turn on and say, well, I'm just going to do this and it's going to be amazing. Like I have to wake up every single day and dedicate that day to being excellent, right? And finding the like one thing that I'm not the most excellent on and working on that until I am. And then finding the next one thing that I'm not most excellent on and working on that until I am. And the commitment and effort level that it takes to do that is not for the faint of heart, frankly. Now, what I'll say is, in most professions, right, you can get away with not being the best, right? Like, you may not be the best accountant or whatever. You might be a good one. Like, I'm not trying to downgrade who you are as a person, right? You might be a really good accountant, but are you really the best? And do you want to be, right? Maybe not, right? And the answer to that's probably no. I don't want to be the best accountant in the United States of America. I don't know what award you would win for that, but maybe you would. Or I don't necessarily want to be the number one salesperson or whatever. Or maybe you do. I'm not sure. But if you do, then man, you better get up for it, because the requirement to be the best at something is very high. And the hill you got to climb to be the best is very steep, right? And so it's not just something you're like, I'm going to be the best, and then you like turn the switch on and you are. You got to like get up every day and practice your craft and make yourself the best at it. And personally, I think, there are some professions that indeed it requires you to put forth the effort to be the best. And even if you are not, right, like if you're not the best fighter pilot in the room because you're in the room with me, and you won't be because I'm the best. Even if you're not the best of whatever it is in the room, you sort of have a moral obligation, or even, right, a self-preservation obligation to like at least attempt to be the best, or be the best that you can be, which is better than you are right now. Doctors maybe is a good example, right? Police officers, people that have this sort of public good, or the demand on them being excellent is super high because the cost of failure is super high, right? So I think that, you're going to get up every day and decide if you're going to be the best that day or not. And if you're not deciding that you're going to be the best pretty much every day that you get up, then you're not going to be. And that's just the facts of the matter, right? And so, and it's just unfortunate, right? I think, and it's a reality that most of us have to face, is that, hey, today is not my day. Tomorrow's not going to be your day either, and the day after that, right? Because you're not willing to pay the price. And frankly, it's not always a good time, right? Like, you're going to have to sacrifice things that you want to do. You're going to have to get up every day and do this thing to the best of your ability at the expense of other things. And it frankly can become all-consuming. You talk to people who are the best in their craft, and they talk about this as like it's the only thing they do. And there's a lot of truth to that, right? Like, it is the only thing that they do. They eat, sleep, think that all the time. And so I just feel like most people are not willing to pay that price. And if you say you're going to pay the price to be excellent, then buckle up, buttercup, because it's a big road. And the sad fact is that most people won't do it. And you know what? Winning doesn't care, right? Like, winning doesn't care if you do or don't do it, because somebody else will do it, and then they will be better than you, and that's just all there is to it. Like, there is no justice in this thing. If you don't pay the price, you don't get the prize. So, that is the sad reality of being the best, right? Is that you're just going to have to put in the work and pay the price, and it's going to be hard, and it's not going to be fun, and people are going to take shots at you, right? And it's not always going to be popular, and you're not going to make a lot of friends doing it sometimes, right? So are you willing to put in the work? Because if you are, cool. Like, the reward is amazing, right? Getting to fulfill your dreams is amazing. Getting to claim titles of whatever it is amazing, right? There is a lot of reward that goes along with being the best. But just keep in mind that there is a lot of cost that goes along with being the best. And so you just better be ready to pay it. Happy note to end on. As always, you can like and follow me at the Fighter Pilot Professor on Instagram and YouTube. Tell your friends, shoot them on podcast, let them listen, let them see how awesome it is. Let them know that, hey, this dude is the best at this thing. He's paid the price. Have a good one.